In the spring of 1941, across the mahogany tables of Whitehall, a conviction reigned absolute. The British Empire would prevail in North Africa. This was not mere optimism, it was institutional certainty, forged through decades of colonial warfare and reinforced by the empire's vast territorial reach. The reasoning seemed sound. Britain commanded strategic positions from Gibraltar to Suez, controlled Mediterranean shipping lanes, and possessed garrison forces scattered across 3 continents. The British military establishment had managed revolts, suppressed uprisings, and maintained order across deserts, jungles, and mountains for generations. Why would Libya be different? Senior officers in Cairo reviewed maps with practiced confidence. They commanded more troops, controlled more territory, and possessed supply lines stretching back to the industrial heart of the empire. The enemy, this newly arrived German expeditionary force, numbered perhaps 30,000 men, operating at the end of impossibly long supply routes across the Mediterranean. Logic suggested British superiority, experience demanded it, pride insisted upon it. But beneath this confidence lay a dangerous assumption that colonial policing operations had prepared the British Army for mechanized warfare against a modern, professionally led force. The campaigns in Sudan, the frontier wars in India, even the Great War's static trenches, none of these had truly tested Britain's ability to wage rapid, mobile warfare across vast open spaces against an enemy who understood modern combined arms doctrine. The British underestimated more than just German capabilities. They underestimated how completely warfare had evolved, how decisively speed and coordination now trumped numerical advantage, and how vulnerable long supply lines became when facing an enemy who moved with unprecedented velocity. 1.2. The emergence of Rommel. Erwin Rommel arrived in Tripoli in February 1941 with a reputation earned in France: aggressive, unconventional, relentlessly offensive. The British intelligence assessments noted his arrival, but failed to grasp what it meant. Rommel did not fight like British generals expected. He did not establish defensive positions and wait for reinforcements. He did not follow the methodical approach that characterized most military operations. Instead, within weeks of landing, he attacked. His tactics defied conventional military wisdom. He led from the front, often positioning himself with forward reconnaissance units, making decisions in real time based on immediate battlefield intelligence rather than reports filtered through layers of command. He moved his forces at night, exploiting British reluctance to operate in darkness. He concentrated his armor for devastating strikes against British weak points, then dispersed before counterattacks could form. Most critically, Rommel understood the psychology of desert warfare. He grasped that in the vast emptiness of North Africa, perception mattered as much as reality. By moving rapidly and appearing in unexpected locations, he created the impression of a force far larger than it actually was. British commanders, receiving reports of German tanks attacking simultaneously at multiple points, assumed they faced overwhelming numbers. Often they were seeing the same units redeploying with extraordinary speed. Rommel also possessed an intuitive understanding of logistics, specifically British logistics. He studied captured supply documents, interrogated prisoners about depot locations, and analyzed the patterns of British convoys. He began to predict where supplies would accumulate, when reinforcements would arrive, and which routes the British considered secure. The Afrika Korps became an extension of Rommel's tactical philosophy: lean, mobile, opportunistic. While British units advanced with elaborate supply trains and established fortified positions, German forces traveled light, seized enemy supplies whenever possible, and treated the desert itself as an ally rather than an obstacle. The British learned of Rommel's approach through bitter experience. In late March 1941, the Afrika Korps launched an offensive that should have been impossible. Intelligence suggested the Germans lacked sufficient forces for major operations. Supply assessments indicated they could not sustain an advance, yet advance they did. British positions that seemed secure suddenly found themselves outflanked. Units that expected reinforcements discovered German armor cutting their supply lines. Defensive positions carefully prepared became irrelevant as the Afrika Korps simply bypassed them, striking deep into British rear areas. The fall of Benghazi came with shocking speed. El Agheila followed. By mid-April, Rommel had pushed the British back across hundreds of miles, reversing months of gains and besieging Tobruk, a fortress port the British considered impregnable. In London, the defeats sparked confusion rather than alarm. These setbacks seemed temporary, aberrations that would correct themselves once proper resources arrived. The narrative remained intact. British forces were temporarily disadvantaged but would soon reassert control. But in Cairo, among the officers coordinating operations, a different understanding began to form. The Germans were not simply lucky. They were not temporarily overperforming. They were systematically outfighting British forces through superior tactics, better coordination, and more effective use of available resources. Reports began flowing back to London, reports that did not match the official optimism. Officers described German tanks appearing where reconnaissance had reported clear ground. They detailed supply convoys ambushed despite traveling routes assumed secure. They documented British counterattacks that arrived hours too late because German forces had already redeployed. A pattern emerged. The British were fighting a reactive war, constantly responding to German initiatives, never quite able to seize the operational tempo. And in desert warfare, where mobility determined survival, the side reacting was the side losing. Yet still, the institutional response remained: send more troops, establish better defenses, improve coordination. The fundamental assumption that Britain possessed the capacity to defeat the Afrika Korps through its own resources remained unchallenged. This assumption would not survive the coming months. While German armor raced across the desert, British quartermasters confronted a different kind of warfare. One fought in maintenance depots, supply dumps, and repair workshops. The British Army's mechanized forces depended on vehicles designed for European roads, not desert conditions. Trucks overheated in the relentless heat. Tank engines clogged with fine sand that infiltrated even supposedly sealed components. Spare parts, manufactured in Britain and shipped across thousands of miles, arrived in insufficient quantities or wrong specifications. A British tank company nominally fielded 50 vehicles, but on any given day, perhaps 30 were operational. The rest sat immobilized, awaiting parts, undergoing repairs, were simply broken down in conditions their designers never anticipated. German mechanics, by contrast, kept a higher percentage of their vehicles combat-ready through improvisation and better desert adaptation. The logistical challenges extended beyond maintenance. British supply lines stretched from Alexandria to forward positions hundreds of miles west, vulnerable routes that German reconnaissance aircraft mapped with precision. Rommel's forces repeatedly struck these supply columns, destroying fuel trucks and ammunition carriers that could not be quickly replaced. Water proved as critical as ammunition.
Each British soldier required gallons per day in the scorching heat. Forward units depended on regular supply runs just to survive, creating predictable patterns the Afrika Korps exploited ruthlessly. German forces, traveling lighter and more dispersed, presented fewer concentrated targets. Communication systems failed regularly. Radio equipment designed for temperate climates malfunctioned in extreme temperatures. Orders arrived late or garbled. Coordination between units broke down precisely when rapid response meant the difference between victory and retreat. These were not glamorous problems. They generated no headlines, earned no medals. But collectively, they created a military force operating at perhaps 70% effectiveness. Adequate against irregular forces, disastrous against a professional opponent who operated at 95%. 2.2. The Afrika Korps structure. German efficiency in North Africa stemmed from deliberate organizational choices made before a single tank rolled off the transport ships. Rommel built the Afrika Korps around mobility. Every unit could move rapidly, operate independently for limited periods, and integrate seamlessly into larger formations. Tank battalions traveled with their own artillery, anti-aircraft guns, and mechanized infantry, combined arms packages that could engage any enemy without waiting for support. The Germans also benefited from superior equipment for desert conditions. Their Panzer III and IV tanks, while not dramatically superior to British models in raw specifications, proved more reliable in sustained operations. German transport trucks, many captured from previous campaigns, had been tested across varied terrain. Maintenance equipment became a core competency rather than an afterthought. But the Afrika Korps' most significant advantage lay in intelligence gathering and analysis. German signals intelligence units intercepted British signals, often reading decoded messages before British recipients. This intelligence advantage allowed Rommel to anticipate British movements, identify weak points in defensive lines, and position his forces for maximum effect. The Germans also developed superior reconnaissance practices. Light armored cars ranged far ahead of main forces, mapping British positions and identifying supply routes. Luftwaffe aircraft provided regular aerial surveillance despite British air superiority. This information flowed rapidly to Rommel, who made immediate tactical decisions rather than waiting for formal intelligence assessments. Perhaps most importantly, the Afrika Korps operated with a decentralized command philosophy. Officers at every level received clear objectives but possessed authority to adapt tactics based on immediate conditions. When opportunities appeared, German units exploited them instantly rather than requesting permission through layers of command. This organizational culture created an enemy that seemed almost prescient, one that appeared where British commanders least expected, struck with coordinated violence, then vanished before counterattacks materialized.
By late 1941, British military headquarters in Cairo operated in a fog of cognitive dissonance. Official communications to London maintained optimism, describing temporary setbacks and imminent offensives. Internal assessments told a darker story. Field commanders submitted reports detailing German tactical superiority. They described enemy forces that moved faster, hit harder, and coordinated more effectively than British units. They requested better equipment, more reliable vehicles, improved radio systems, acknowledgments that current resources proved inadequate. But admitting systemic inadequacy carried professional risk. Generals who reported that British forces were structurally inferior to the Afrika Korps faced questions about their own competence. Were they making excuses, lacking resolve, failing in leadership? A subtle pressure developed.
Reports could acknowledge difficulties, but must not suggest fundamental inability to prevail. Defeats could be explained by temporary disadvantages, surprise, bad weather, equipment malfunctions, but not by deeper structural problems. The narrative remained that with proper reinforcement and better coordination, British forces would triumph. This created a dangerous feedback loop. London received sanitized assessments suggesting that more of the same, more troops, more tanks, better supplied through existing systems, would reverse British fortunes. Meanwhile, officers who understood the deeper problems faced pressure to remain optimistic or risk their careers. In war rooms across Cairo, conversations occurred in lowered voices. Officers privately acknowledged what official reports could not. The Afrika Korps was not simply a capable opponent. It was systematically superior in the type of warfare the desert demanded. British forces fought bravely, often heroically, but bravery could not compensate for structural disadvantages in mobility, logistics, and tactical doctrine. The question no one wanted to articulate: could Britain actually win this campaign with its available resources?
In early 1942, a small group of analysts in London received an uncomfortable assignment: compile a comprehensive, unvarnished assessment of British capabilities in North Africa compared to German forces and American industrial capacity. These were not field commanders concerned with morale or politicians worried about public perception. They were logisticians, industrial planners, and intelligence officers tasked with mathematical truth. Their assignment? Determine whether Britain could defeat the Afrika Korps with available and projected resources. They began with production figures. British factories produced tanks, trucks, and aircraft at rates that seemed impressive in isolation. But when compared to losses in North Africa and other theaters, the numbers revealed a sobering reality. Britain was losing equipment faster than it could be replaced from domestic production alone. The analysts examined shipping capacity. Every vehicle, every shell, every gallon of fuel sent to Egypt meant less available for other theaters. Britain was fighting on multiple fronts, defending the home islands, protecting Atlantic convoys, maintaining forces in the Far East. North Africa consumed resources that could not be easily spared. They studied German production despite imperfect intelligence. Estimates suggested the Afrika Korps could be reinforced and resupplied adequately to maintain current operational tempo indefinitely. Britain could not match this sustainment without drawing resources from other critical areas. Then they examined American industrial capacity, figures that seemed almost fantastical. American factories could produce in months what Britain manufactured in years. American truck production alone exceeded British total vehicle output. If supplied with American equipment, British forces would possess advantages in quantity and quality simultaneously. The conclusion became inescapable. Britain could continue fighting in North Africa with existing resources, but could not achieve decisive victory against a competent, well-supplied opponent. Stalemate was possible. Triumph was not. The report arrived on desks in Whitehall in early 1942, a classified document with restricted distribution. Its title was bureaucratic, its contents explosive. The meeting convened in a windowless room, attended by senior military officers and government officials. Maps covered the walls, showing British positions, supply routes, and enemy dispositions. The atmosphere was heavy. Everyone present understood this was not a routine briefing. The lead analyst presented findings with clinical detachment. No rhetoric, no appeals to courage or tradition, just numbers, comparisons, projections. British tank production, insufficient to replace losses while maintaining forces in other theaters. vehicle reliability in desert conditions, significantly inferior to German equipment, supply line vulnerability, a fundamental disadvantage that could not be remedied through better tactics, intelligence capabilities, comprehensively inferior to German signals interception. Then came the comparison with potential American contribution. The differential was stark. American production capacity exceeded British by factors of 3, 5, even 10 in critical categories. American trucks were more reliable. American tanks, when they arrived in quantity, would outnumber German armor decisively. The analyst reached the conclusion written clearly in the report. Decisive victory in North Africa cannot be achieved with British resources alone. American industrial capacity and direct military involvement are necessary to overcome German advantages and achieve strategic objectives. Silence followed. This was not merely an admission of temporary difficulty. This was an acknowledgement that the British Empire, which had dominated global affairs for centuries, could not defeat a German expeditionary force numbering fewer than 100,000 men without assistance from a former colony. 3.3. The emotional impact. No one disputed the analysis. The numbers were irrefutable, the logic sound. But accepting the conclusion meant confronting a reality that contradicted Britain's self-conception. For generations, British military tradition emphasized courage, determination, and the ability to triumph against odds. The empire had prevailed through these qualities in countless conflicts. Now, analysts were saying these qualities were insufficient, that industrial capacity mattered more than valor, that production lines determined outcomes more decisively than battlefield courage. An officer present at the meeting later described the atmosphere as funereal. Men who had built careers on the assumption of British military superiority now faced evidence of fundamental inadequacy. Not moral inadequacy. British soldiers fought as bravely as any, but structural, industrial, logistical inadequacy that no amount of courage could overcome. The word America hung in the air, unspoken but omnipresent. Everyone understood the implication. Britain needed American help, not as a junior partner contributing modest support, but as the primary industrial engine powering the war effort. This was not the partnership of equals Britain had envisioned. This was dependence. America's entry into the war following Pearl Harbor in December 1941 transformed British strategic calculations overnight. What had been a theoretical possibility, American industrial power directed toward defeating the Axis, became immediate reality. The Lend-Lease program, already supplying Britain with equipment, intensified dramatically. American factories shifted to wartime production, churning out tanks, aircraft, trucks, and weapons in quantities that dwarfed British output. Sherman tanks began arriving in North Africa by the hundreds, then thousands. American trucks, rugged, reliable, designed for varied terrain, replaced British vehicles that had proven inadequate for desert conditions. The impact was immediate and measurable. British units that had operated at partial strength due to equipment shortages suddenly found themselves fully equipped. Supply convoys that had struggled with breakdowns now moved reliably. Tank battalions that had maintained perhaps 60% operational readiness climbed to 80 or 90%. But material was only part of the transformation. American entry meant fresh troops, new tactical approaches, and, critically, a second front that would force the Afrika Korps to divide attention and resources. 4.2. Operation Torch, November 1942. In November 1942, American forces landed in Morocco and Algeria in Operation Torch, the first major American ground operation against German forces. The landings placed Allied forces west of the Afrika Korps, while British forces pressed from the east. For Rommel, this changed everything.
He now faced enemies on two fronts, with supply lines stretched impossibly thin. The Mediterranean, dominated by Allied naval and air power, became increasingly dangerous for Axis shipping. Fuel, ammunition, and replacement vehicles that the Afrika Korps desperately needed sat in Italian ports, unable to cross the water safely. The operational situation that Rommel had exploited so brilliantly, mobility, surprise, attacking weak points, now worked against him. Allied forces could concentrate overwhelming strength, while German and Italian forces, trapped between converging armies, lacked space to maneuver. American forces initially showed inexperience. German veterans exploited tactical mistakes, inflicted casualties, and demonstrated the gulf between training and combat reality. But the Americans learned quickly, and more importantly, they possessed resources to absorb losses and continue attacking. British forces, now equipped largely with American vehicles and supplied through American logistics, operated with effectiveness impossible months earlier. The cumulative pressure from both directions compressed Axis positions progressively, eliminating the strategic depth that had allowed the Afrika Korps to operate so effectively.
By May 1943, the Afrika Korps surrendered in Tunisia. Rommel himself had been evacuated weeks earlier, his legendary desert campaign concluded in defeat. The German and Italian forces that surrendered numbered over 200,000, more troops than the Afrika Korps had fielded at its peak. They were defeated not through superior tactics or better generalship, but through overwhelming material superiority that no amount of skill could overcome. The lesson was clear, if bitter for British pride. Modern warfare was decided by industrial capacity. The side that could produce more tanks, more trucks, more aircraft, more shells, and deliver them to the battlefield would prevail regardless of tactical brilliance. Rommel remained a formidable commander to the end. His tactical innovations would be studied for decades. But in the final analysis, he was one commander leading limited forces against the combined industrial might of Britain and America. No amount of desert expertise could compensate for that disparity. The British understanding that emerged from that classified report in 1942 proved accurate. North Africa could not be won through British resources alone. American industrial power, the factories of Detroit, the shipyards of the East Coast, the aircraft plants scattered across the continent, proved decisive. That realization marked a fundamental shift in British strategic thinking. The empire that had dominated global affairs for 2 centuries now understood it required partnership with its former colony to prevail against existential threats. The relationship forged in that acknowledgement would define not just the remainder of the war, but the post-war international order. The Desert War had taught a harsh lesson. Courage, tradition, and tactical skill remained important, but industrial capacity determined outcomes in modern conflict. The nation that could produce more, faster, and deliver it reliably to the battlefield would win. Britain possessed the courage and skill. America possessed the factories. Together, they possessed victory.